And now we move completely into part 2 of the course, where we start talking about climate negotiation fallacies. I often call them tactics because when I encounter these fallacies in practice, it's typically used as a tactic in the negotiation or in the discussion to shift things along. So I will, in the upcoming lessons, use the word tactic and fallacy almost interchangeably, and that's the basic reason why. Now, we're going to cover 4 fallacies that are used primarily by folks who, when they're in the denial, anger, depression stage of climate grief cycle. And they have some common characteristics in the sense of how we have to deal with them. And at this stage, people really aren't negotiating per se. They're really looking for the issue to go away. And so that's what we have to confront with these first 4 fallacies. And the first one out of the blocks is moving the goalpost, or as it's often called, not a true Scotsman. Now, the objectives of this lesson are to gain familiarity with the moving the goalpost fallacy, recognize how it can crop up in our climate negotiations, and then finally to develop an understanding of what to do about it. So what is the moving the goalpost fallacy? Well, if you go and look this up in a philosophy textbook, they're going to give you what seems to be a very convoluted definition for what is in fact a really simple tactic. But so they'll say it's demanding an opponent to address more and more points after the initial counter-argument has been satisfied, which is a definition, granted, I find confusing. But really, as we look at it more closely, it's changing the parameters of an argument to avoid being wrong. And it crops up everywhere, in our relationships, in the workplace, in politics, and unfortunately, it is all too common in our climate negotiation work. So I think it works best to see this through an example. And like I said, it's also known as not a true Scotsman. And the reason is that typically the examples used when we discuss this fallacy revolve around being how good a Scotsman the person might be. So this is typically why it's called that. But the example would go something like this. So I could say, all Scotsmen wear kilts. And you could reply, but my buddy is a Scot and he never wears a kilt. So I say, then your buddy is not a true Scotsman. So if we take a look at this more closely, you'll notice that I've never defined Scotsman. It's offered only by the other party, and it changes the parameters as we go along. So it's a form of power gaming. We give permission to redefine the argument and cede power to the other guy to do so. And if we're going to carry on the discussion, we have to agree to those definitions to stay engaged. Or so we're led to believe. But there is no end to this. Every time we answer one of the concerns, a new concern is raised. So I'd say all Scotsmen wear kilts. The answer is, my buddy is a Scotsman. He doesn't wear a kilt. And you say, well, he's not a true Scotsman. Then what is a true Scotsman? Now, I think there is a test for this that we can apply as we move through climate negotiations, because oftentimes we may feel that we're blind to the tactic. It's so common that we are numb to it. People do it, we don't really see it. We get engaged in that whole discussion of the definitions as opposed to the core argument. But there is a test. And the test I find myself using more often than not is if I'm asking myself the question, are they never satisfied? Then we're likely dealing with not a true Scotsman. Now, in climate negotiation, here's an example that I've personally encountered a number of times. And this shows how it can crop into our climate negotiation discussions. So I could say, I think that Alberta should take action on climate change. And somebody will say to me, Albertans don't believe in climate change. Then I could answer, and I'm an Albertan, and I accept that climate change is real and we need to take action. And then they say, but you're not a real Albertan. You don't work in energy. You are not a blue-collar worker. You weren't born here. So let's take a closer look at this. You'll notice that as we go through the discussion, the parameters keep changing. Simply living in Alberta for almost 40 years isn't sufficient to define me as Albertan, according to the counterparty here. And I don't have a say in that definition. As we go along, they will keep changing it. So they'll say things like, I do the wrong sort of work, or I haven't been here long enough, or I wasn't born here. So every time we move forward a step, they add something else to the definition of Albertan. That means that I have no say in this. And they don't give me a say in framing that discussion. They can change it anytime they want. And my conclusion about all of that is that this really isn't a negotiation. It may feel like it. It may seem like we're debating back and forth, but in fact, it's not a negotiation at all. And it's a no-win situation. And you'll notice also, we're no longer talking about climate action. We're talking about how good an Albertan I am. And so we're no longer on our core message as we talked about in part 1 of this course. We're talking about me, not about climate. And it is a symptom of denial. And it can easily morph into depression or anger. So we have to be careful with this because, people, like I said, this is a very fluid stage of these negotiations, and people can pop back and forth in here very quickly. And like I said, it could seem like a negotiation, but in fact, the person you're talking to is actually avoiding the core discussion. And it can also be couched to seem really reasonable. It's just sort of a discussion about how do we define a pure Albertan and all that sort of thing. But in fact, it's a no-win situation because I have, in this example, ceded power to the other guy to define what is an Albertan. And it can go on and on and on. So we have to be very aware of it and intervene in that, break the process so that we stop that long chain of discussion about defining who and who is not a true Albertan. So I will do this I will do this in every lecture coming up, about the do's and don'ts about dealing with this. So here are the things that I would suggest based on my experience in climate negotiation and dealing with people who are using a moving the goalpost type tactic. So I encourage people to use open listening. Hear what they're actually saying. Not the definition of, for example, what a true Albertan is, but what's underneath all of that? What are their fears? What are they really concerned about? And to do that, we have to be really patient. And we have to ask for clarification. What do you mean by, let's get our parameters straight. And to do that, we have to, as I said earlier in the course, understand our own position. So what's our core message? And we have to stay on that message. And ultimately, we do have to seek common ground. So those are the do's. The don'ts, don't offer up facts and figures. This is really tempting, especially for us technocratic types. We want to offer up facts and figures and show why we're right. But if people are in true denial, they're not listening. All they're doing is working out counter arguments to our facts. And they just want us to give up and go away. And the other don't is don't respond with anger. It can be really frustrating, and it is so easy to get angry ourselves. But as I said earlier, and we'll say again and again, when you respond with anger, you just inflate the anger. And remember, you have a say in how the discussion's framed. You don't need to give power to the other side. This should be a fair discussion. So if they're going to start redefining Albertans and what is a true and not a true Albertan, I could say, this is not a discussion about who or who is not a true Albertan. We're all Albertans. We live here. We all have a say. Now, I caution you that people can get angry when you do that. They can say, well, I need to, you're not a true Albertan, and we're not going to have that discussion with you, and they get very, very heated. And you may have to decide whether you need their goodwill or not. And sometimes if you feel you need it, then you may have to address it more in more of a confrontational way. But if you don't, sometimes it's best just to walk away. And the reason I say that is that trolls love to use this tactic. So trolls will be at the table and they'll be throwing out these moving goalpost arguments all over the place. And if we get engaged with them, we are going to find ourselves diverted from our core message very quickly. But we do have the power to have a meaningful discussion. It's in our own hands. We don't need to give the power to the other guy. So if we go back to our chart, in the fallacies we consider, the unique feature of dealing with moving the goalposts is that we have a say in framing of the discussion. And the common features that cross all four of these denial, depression, anger tactics is open listening, being patient, understanding our own core message, and seeking common ground. So in this lesson, I covered moving the goalpost fallacy, how it crops up in climate negotiation, and what you might do about it. Feel free to comment below, and we'll share those comments with the other participants of the course and carry on our discussions.